sort of brief talk that I'd like to do today focuses on a project that actually Alison was a part of. And it takes us back to 2019, and I'm going to give a little backstory to that. I should also say as well, many thanks to those of you who also were participants in that project, who I can see in the audience today. So this is a photograph of for the most part, a group of theatre studies students at Brunel back in 2019. And you can see that they're all gathered around a particular headstone. Now, this is an unusual headstone. It's in St. John the Baptist Church in Hillingdon. And it marks the resting place of an African slave named Toby Pleasant. I came upon this gravestone and the life of Toby Pleasant quite by accident one day. I was in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and I was flicking through a book because the title struck me. It was Unusual Headstones of Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, Herefordshire, Oxfordshire, and so on and so forth. And it just caught my attention. And I came upon a page where there was an extract, and it simply mentioned that there was a grave of a slave in a church in Hillingdon, with no more details than that. And I'm smiling here because my former PhD student, Monica, was part of this story, where I dragged her around several churchyards in Hillingdon trying to find the grave of Toby Pleasant. And eventually, to cut a long story short, we did find him buried here in St. John the Baptist churchyard. And that really marks the beginning of the story, because as a scholar of the slave trade and slavery, what particularly interested me and continues to interest me is the ways in which most particularly the narratives of Britain's relationship with slavery and abolition is a story in which certain voices are hidden, concealed, erased, ignored, overlooked, marginalised, whilst others are much more dominant and prominent. And most particularly the story of British slavery and abolition focuses most particularly on the likes of William Wilberforce and the parliamentary campaign to abolish the slave trade, much more so in the public imagination and public history than Britain's deep centuries-long involvement in the slave trade itself. So the story of Britain's relationship is usually one which celebrates British abolition, but actually shies away from confronting the really difficult, uncomfortable truths of Britain's involvement in the expansion of the slave trade, most particularly in the 18th century and into the early 19th century. And part of that history obscures the roles of many people in Britain who objected to the slave trade, who participated very vocally in that objection, not just the likes of William Wilberforce, or not only William Wilberforce, but, for example, many former slaves who had found their way to Britain on British ships, who had secured their freedom, who formed societies and organisations in Britain in the 18th century to contest and to demand the abolition of the slave trade. Their experiences, the vital role they played in the abolition of the slave trade is often forgotten in public memory, alongside the really important voices of women, British women up and down the UK, who also, at a time when women were not permitted socially to have a voice in the public political sphere without serious censure and reproach, public reproach, the very prominent role that women played in the campaign to abolish the slave trade, and most particularly to abolish slavery. So that's really the backstory to all of this, a sense of the ways in which what we know in terms of academic history, the ways in which that hasn't really aligned with public history. The public history of slavery and the slave trade still centres around those very dominant narratives of Parliament and abolition, the likes of William Wilberforce. Alison and I were part of a research group at the time when a call by the Being Human Festival, which is a UK national festival for humanities in 2019, put out a call to support public engagement projects on the theme of secrets and discoveries. And it wasn't long before that I had come across the headstone of Tobias Pleasant, also known as Toby Pleasant in the records. And so this was really an opportunity for us as historians working in this field to think about the ways in which we could engage the public with narratives of slavery and abolition, thinking about the ways in which we could recover those marginalized experiences, marginalized contributions, marginalized voices on the subject of British slavery and abolition. And so as part of that, I know some of you were also joined me. We organised a walking tour in Uxbridge and Hillingdon, where we started at the headstone of Toby Pleasant and made our way through the graveyard there, also recognising the headstones of former slave owners in the Uxbridge area. In fact, quite chillingly, Tobias Pleasant's headstone overlooks one of the key slave-owning families in the Uxbridge-Hillingdon area. And then from there, we made our way over to the former residence of William Wilberforce, whilst telling and discussing and talking through the dialogues, the narratives of enslaved people and the campaign to abolish the slave trade and slavery. In addition to the walking tours, we also had a public exhibition here at Brunel, where we showcased the work of the British and Foreign School Society. This was an organisation which was set up in the early 19th century. It has a direct connection to Brunel University because before Brunel became Brunel back in the 60s, it was an assemblage of teacher training institutions, and one of those was an institution called Borough Road College. It was the first teacher training college to be set up in the UK. And it was set up by social reformers. And among those sitting on the committee were abolitionists, including William Wilberforce. And it was the trained teachers from Borough Road College who were sent to the Caribbean before the abolition of slavery to try to educate enslaved children. And we have various artifacts documenting this in the Brunel archives. And so the archivists, in conjunction with myself and Alison, put together an exhibition to really tell this largely unknown local history, and this was a very important part of our project, to try to connect the local with the global. So this local history of slavery and abolition, the ways in which these two really uncomfortably sit together. Another part of that project was a talk, actually, which took place, a public lecture, which took place in the auditorium here with myself and David Olusoga, British-Nigerian historian who has written extensively on the slave trade and slavery, and we looked at trying, the ways in which we could try to uncover Britain's relationship with slavery and abolition, how we might think about that differently. And very finally, and perhaps most challenging of all, but most successful of all, I think, of the events that we organised and developed, was a heritage production, for want of a better way of framing it, called Breaking the Silence. And I worked with a colleague, former colleague at Brunel, now at Essex University, Dr. Holly Maples. And what we were trying to do with this production was to tell a different story of Britain's relationship with slavery and abolition through gathering together a fictitious meeting, an abolitionist meeting. And we brought together different figures within the movement who we imagine and know for a fact as well never really came together in real life. And that was bringing together Wilberforce with the women who had participated very prominently in the British abolition movement, alongside black abolitionists such as Olaudah Equiano and Mary Prince, to try to tell a more nuanced, complicated and layered version of the abolitionist campaign. And in that sense, what we were trying to do, and hence the name Breaking the Silence, was to try to disrupt the traditional narratives of slavery and abolition and tried to amplify those voices that had been marginalized and those figures who had been very much put at the margins of the both academic discourse and public history about slavery and abolition. And these are just some images from that. You can see here in the image here that one important part of our aim with Breaking the Silence was to be an immersive production. We've just had a conversation here about wargaming and how this is engaging people. And we were very much concerned to bring the audience into our production and to try to engage the audience with the questions that we were raising, not only about the ways in which slavery and abolition had been represented historically in the past, but the ways in which it was being understood or not understood in the present. And so you can see here the example that the actors were actually sitting in the audience, and we very deliberately set the church up at St. John the Baptist, where we performed with Toby Pleasant in his resting place just outside. We brought the actors into the audience, so we set it up as an abolitionist meeting. And the way that I scripted this was to, with certain questions that were being presented by the likes of Wilberforce, was to get the audience, to encourage the audience to actually participate as well, which they did, thankfully, without much prompting at all. And so this was a really successful project. There was a lot of public engagement, a lot of public feedback. It was immensely rewarding to be part of it. And myself and Holly and others who were involved in it very much felt afterwards that, and the feedback certainly we were getting from the public, was that this should be the starting point and not the end point of this project, that actually this was something that should be taken further afield and shared. And then two things happened in 2020. First of all, we had COVID, but also we had the Black Lives Matter, which really sort of crescendoed here in the UK with the fall of Colston, Edward Colston, the slave trader, on the 7th of June 2020. And I think what that did, and all of you will be very aware of that, I know, but I think what that did was to bring to public consciousness whichever side of the political field and fence you stood on. But I think what it did was to show actually how very little knowledge the public generally had about Britain's relationship with slavery, and the ways in which, importantly, that relationship to some extent endures and still causes pain. And actually, in part as a consequence of that, we managed to secure funding from Arts Council England, among other institutions, to take Breaking the Silence on a UK-wide tour in 2021. And we were very keen with this production to go to sites that have a very clear connection with Britain's slave past or with abolition, to perform in generally small venues, churches, to retain the immersive aim of the performance, to bring the audience into the performance, but also each... And at the time, myself and Holly were kicking ourselves about doing this. I wasn't quite realize the implications of writing 10 different scripts. But we decided that in each performance, there would be an element which would be specific to the site where the theatre company, we now had a professional theatre company touring with us. Each of the places that we visited with its particular connection, this would be signified in the performance. So what we were trying to do there was to connect, again, the local and the global, but also to be thinking about sites of public memory and how history and memory become really entangled and complicated and uncomfortable as well. And just as before, we were seeking to reconfigure public narratives about slavery and abolition. And so just to give you one example from one production where we performed was in St. Mary's Church in Henbury, in Cambridgeshire, and this church is famous because it was the site where Alado Equiano, one of the UK's most prominent black abolitionists, was married to an Englishwoman, Susanna Cullen. This is a really quite little-known story, but if you're from Henbury, you do know this, and the local and the global connection here. Equiano was absolutely instrumental with the British abolitionist movement because in 1789 he published his interesting narrative of the life of Gustavus Vassa. This was one of the pseudonyms that he went by. And his publication was critical for several reasons. One, it was a testimony of a former slave of the British slave trade, somebody who'd been kidnapped as a child into slavery and put on a British ship bound for the Caribbean. So it was an important and unique testimony in that respect. But at a time when MPs were trying to contest the prejudice, the racism, some of the very embedded narratives of support for the slave trade, Equiano's narrative was absolutely critical to bringing into Parliament the experiences of the enslaved themselves. So in a public political space where, of course, the enslaved were not directly represented, where their views were not welcomed or invited, there was no witness testimony from the enslaved, only witness testimony from the slaveholders and those who had been involved in slavery. Equiano's narrative was absolutely critical in 1789 because it exposed the horrors of the slave trade, one of the grounds upon which the abolitionists were fighting their battle. And so I just want to conclude this short presentation here by just sharing with you some of the public feedback about that production and just to highlight, I think, a couple of themes from that feedback which we might go on to talk about in terms of thinking about the impact of the ways in which the writing of history and public understanding of history, how those two align and operate together in terms of the ways in which the past and the present also dialogue. And what was particularly struck me about some of these comments was somebody seeing this production and that making them feel that they were a part of the community, that their opinion mattered. And another comment, I felt that I belonged. So this notion of when we start to expand the number and the nature of the voices that we explore and investigate in historical study, we're doing something there. We're doing some much deeper work there to do with community and identity and belonging. And I think that's something which is also has been raised as well with the whole debates about statues and also with the fall of the Colston statue. Who feels alienated by the presence of certain dominant histories, dominant voices, dominant statues? Who feels that they belong when those statues, when those voices, and who gets to dominate the narrative changes? So thank you very much.
So I'm talking about working class autobiography and proletarian autobiographiction, which is an area I've been researching recently, particularly here at Brunel in the Burnett archive of working class autobiographies, which is held in special collections in the library over there. Now, the reason I called this Voices Out of Time is because these are not just silenced and marginalised voices, although, in fact, a number of the manuscripts in the Working Class Autobiographies archive would otherwise be silent and marginalised because they're not available anywhere else. You can just find the manuscripts there. But in fact, some of these people who are in there, such as this chap here, Harold Heslop, a Durham miner, the typescript of his autobiography is in there, but his autobiography has also been published, as were his novels that he was writing during the 1920s and 1930s, but they're now no longer in print. So there's voices that at some point had a voice, were public, and have gone back to being silenced and marginalised, along with the other voices in the archive, if you like, that have always been silenced and marginalised. And part of that is to do with time, I think, and a sort of kind of level of working class representation that became central to British culture during the 1930s, was kind of reinforced by the Second World War and the 1945 Labour government, and carries on certainly through the 1960s. If you think the 1960s, representation of the 1960s, it's almost all working class. It's like the Beatles, and it's, on television, sitcoms, it's Steptoe and Son, and it's the Likely Lads, and it carries on until about the 1980s, and then it goes into retreat, perhaps, as the decade of Thatcherism took its toll, as the miners' strike was defeated and the mining industry kind of disappeared. I mean, you have to remember the sort of British mining industry was a huge thing throughout the sort of 19th century and the 20th century, and completely central to certain areas of the country, such as that northeast area where Heslop's coming from, or the valleys of South Wales. And now that's pretty much gone. So that kind of aspect that was central to British life has kind of disappeared. This project was funded by the British Academy, or that sort of section of the research. And I was partly interested in self-reflexivity, how people's diaries reflect periods of social change, how it helps them adapt to social change, how you see new kind of values emerging through people kind of reflecting on what they were doing. I just to mention that because they provided the money. And part of this research was carried on in the Burnett Archive of Working Class Autobiographies, as I said, which is in special collections over there. And then you can see at the top there's me doing, with furiously researching in the archive. And also there's a group of our English and creative writing students in there, because it also gets used as a teaching resource, and also by students from history as well. I think it doesn't get used as much as it could be, seeing as it's, it's one of the, it should ideally be, it is one of the jewels in Brunel's crown. I think it's perhaps not as well known as it might be. And that archive is named after John Burnett, who was in the history department at Brunel in the 1970s and 1980s. And he, along with David Vincent and David Mayle, produced a 3-volume kind of bibliography called The Autobiography of the Working Class, and it's a kind of, you can see that red volume, well, you can just about see it in both of those pictures up there, but you can see it at the sort of bottom left of the picture of me. There's a copy of this Autobiography of the Working Class, and it's a list of all the working class autobiographies they could identify. I think it's for people born between 1790 and 1945. There's 3 volumes. In fact, there's a full volume of sort of additional ones that they sort of added in. And it tells you where all these manuscripts can be found, where they're located, which archive they're in. They're not all in Brunel. The one in Brunel has got about, I think it originally had 276 autobiographies. I think there's a few more now, but it's this amazing resource to go and use. But I'm also, in my title, I've also got autobiographiction, which sounds like a horrible compound modern word. In fact, it's not. It's an Edwardian compound word. And it's about where writers write. It's discussed in the book, the picture of the book I got there, Self-Impression by Max Saunders. But it's about when writers obviously their main protagonist is a version of themselves, but it's not just autobiographical fiction. They're not just revealing their own experiences. They're also kind of elaborating and expanding and imagining their own experiences in slightly different kind of contexts. And the kind of claim is that this permits a fuller autobiography. It's almost like a what might have been. Now that might seem like you're saying, well, you know, we could all say, well, if I'd have been a bit better, a bit more handsome, a bit more whatever, you know, I might have been Prime Minister or whatever. But from a working class viewpoint, you can see it, you know, if I wasn't oppressed by X, Y, and Z, I might have been. Or if this culture wasn't an oppressive political culture in this way, you know, these possibilities might have been. So it's a kind of, and also it's a kind of way of challenging the kind of conventions of respectability that were being talked about in this morning. You can be a bit more risque in an autobiographical fiction than you would necessarily be in your own autobiography. So it's kind of related to autobiography, but it's an enhancement of it. And I talk about specifically proletarian autobiographical fiction. Virginia Woolf might seem an odd person to mention in this context, but one of her definitions, one of her reasons for saying on or about December 1910, human character changed, one of the examples she gives is that Cook, who in the Victorian 19th century period you would never see outside of the kitchen, Cook comes into the drawing room to look at the Daily Herald, and that's an indicator that society's changed. The Victorian, you know, kind of rigid class system is still there, but it's kind of starting to break down. And actually that's what a lot of Virginia Woolf's novels are about, if you strip away the sort of high canonical way that they're often framed. But a more obvious example would be D.H. Lawrence. They're pictured, and Lawrence is also is influential because the kind of people who wrote, working class writers who emerged in the 30s, who was their model, who did they go to, who was, you know, the prime example of somebody from a working class background who had been published, it was D.H. Lawrence, especially if you were a minor. But also, he's part of a movement of people who are moving beyond autobiography, as autobiography is too kind of complicit with those 19th century discourses of progress and the way society is kind of hierarchically ordered. This is much more an exploration of how relationships can change. And for instance, even Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is known for all sorts of wrong reasons, is actually a novel written during the general strike, the aftermath of the general strike. Lawrence actually went back to the mining village he grew up in, Eastwood. The three versions of the novel, one of which, the first one that's not so well known, is where the gamekeeper also goes to Sheffield, works in a steel mill, and joins the Communist Party. So, and it's also investigating, you know, not just the change of class conditions, but the change of gender and sex conditions. So that's an example of the kind of areas that proletarian autobiographical fiction can go into that, you know, just a straightforward autobiography can't. And some of the people who wrote these things were women as well, not just men. If you look at people who were published in the 1930s, there's about 120 men from working class backgrounds. I think there's only 10, well, the source I'm drawing on anyway only identifies 10, two of whom were actually MPs, Ellen Wilkinson and Jenny Lee, who went on to become government ministers in post-war Labour governments. But another example is Ethel Manning, who was a bestseller, who was the son of daughter of a post office sorting clerk, and you know, went to board school and everything, and worked her way up. And her autobiography is listed in that Autobiography of Working Class. It's not in the library here because it was published, Confessions and Impressions, in 1930. Went through 50 impressions, then it became one of the first Penguin paperbacks and sort of went through numerous editions in Penguin. So she was hugely and widely read and very risque, even in her autobiography, actually, saying things like, it's such a mistake to take a conscience with one on an Atlantic crossing. Or another one she wrote, sort of Dorothy Parker-esque, was in New York City, there are no husbands, only married men. So very, very kind of provocative. But she also wrote these very over-the-top autobiographic fictions in which, they're just... She herself described them as creative auto-intoxication, flashy and provocative, showing her kind of mental evolution more than any diary could have conveyed. So that sort of sums up this proletarian autobiographic fiction. But to come back to Harold Heslop, who we had at the beginning, and this is the published version of his autobiography, Out of the Old Earth, which was published in the 90s, but even now it costs you quite a lot to buy a second-hand copy because interest in these writers has gone up, but they're not in print. So what remains is kind of sought after. And Heslop was a miner, he was a political miner, he was a communist. He actually got banned from the mines by the second half of the 1920s because he was too much of a leading strikes and opposition. But he's not propaganda. His work is not propaganda. He's very much, he's very sardonic, he's very ironic. He's more critical, in fact, of the miners and politicians and the unions than in some ways, than the right-wing press would be. And he attacks what he calls proletarian dreaming, the sort of working class ideal of, in this case, of the mines being nationalized, which they were eventually in the 1940s. One of the reasons, of course, let me go on to the next slide. This is one of Heslop's kind of slightly autobiographical novels, Last Cage Down. And there's a passage in there where the main protagonist, who's a kind of, a big Jim, a big, miner, leader, the best miner, the leader of the union, he's fighting the kind of class struggle, but he's also got a relationship with the local barmaid. And what he learns during the course of the novel is how to treat his lover. So you get this passage where it goes, "Good," she said, rising to her feet. "Now help me to clear away." Funny, he'd never done this for his mother in all his life. He had never thought about it. He had always taken it for granted that the clean crockery would be placed before him and the dirty crockery carted away from him before him and cleansed. And he was helping the girl to clear away the dishes while he was damned. So there's a kind of change in gender relations as well. You can see precisely through this kind of autobiographic fiction, a kind of slow sort of change charted in the 30s. But what happened historically was, after 1945, people said politically, well, we don't need to go back to what was explored during the 1930s because we fixed the problems, we solved the depression, we solved the bad conditions for the unemployment because we've got a Labour government and they've introduced full universal employment for all men and they've introduced family allowances for women. And it kind of undermines the sort of more experimental, more, in some ways, modern egalitarian approach of the 1930s that you can find precisely by looking in these books, if you like, that were once central to a culture but have now been kind of suppressed and disappeared. So some brief conclusions. Somebody like Heslop freed himself from the constraints of his background through his autobiographic fiction, which allowed him to think about, class and gender relations as well. The emancipation of women was kind of keenly built into this, partly, I think, driving that shift from autobiography to autobiographic fiction, but also partly being worked out through autobiographic fiction. It helped somebody like Heslop think, what would it be like, to break down these rigid gender roles and help a bit more during the house. And also, this autobiographic fiction can be seen as a means of understanding and adapting to social change, which at the same time generates its own cultural forms and social values. So, thank you for listening. There's some further, there is a blog attached to this project, and it's got its own Twitter thread, which occasionally tweets stuff, so that there's more to look at there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone very much for coming. It's nice to see so many people here, and I would also like to thank Allison for organizing this very interesting session. And thank you all for coming on such a beautiful day when it's so nice outside to come and listen to all of us. I'm going to be old-fashioned and read my paper simply because I'm very conscious of the time and I want to stay within my time period. And also my voice, I've just had COVID, but I'm fine now. I'm negative and all recuperated, but my voice is still, not what it was. So I hope it'll be okay for the rest of the paper. So here is my title, Confronting the Past Through the Present, Contested Borders in Contemporary Queer Francophone Writing from the Maghreb. I'm going to start a little bit by talking about borders and their deconstruction, and then I'll get on to the main part of my paper. Transnational, global, and border studies since the 1990s have challenged a preoccupation with discrete geopolitical and territorial demarcations of state sovereignty and studies of societies and cultures that are primarily state-centered through generating new analyses of mobilities, border crossings, and cross-border negotiations, given that the world has become increasingly composed of relational networks rather than of fixed bases alone. On the other hand, we cannot deny the materiality of geopolitical borders and the ways in which they do indeed structure our views of the world. And some borders have become even more heavily demarcated lately because of demographic shifts, because of migration, asylum, border disputes, as well as various forms of economic and political protectionism, which has reframed nationalisms, turned nation states looking inward in heightened experience of xenophobia, etc., in various parts of the world. And I'm very interested in borders. These are pictures by Samantha Sais, a New York Times photographer. And what she did is she photographed, this is the US border with Mexico. And during the Obama administration, if you were an illegal immigrant in the United States, you were sent home. But your children, and now of course there are adult children, if they're born in the US, they're automatically citizens. So people would actually go to the actual border and meet each other and get together again. So I'm very interested in the encounters that happens at borders themselves. And there's another picture of a mother and daughter who were separated from this because of this legislation. At the same time, however, the paradox of borders as both fixed and fluid and territorial and embodied is by no means a recent phenomenon. Edward Said quite explicitly notes that one of the ongoing legacies of colonial power has been the production of post-colonized subaltern subjects, including migrants, asylum seekers, displaced persons, exiles, and others unassimilated to what he refers to as the emerging structures of institutional power, where post-colonial subjects are caught in the tension between the legacies of colonialism and the newly independent post-colonial nation-state. The borders erected between Europe and its others, between the global North and the global South, not only have their historical antecedents in colonial relations and have helped to perpetuate hegemonic thinking in terms of how the globe is constructed and understood, but are also discursive or symbolic indicators and creators of power relations, hierarchies, and inclusion and othering, given that geopolitical borders are not the only borders that organize social life. To what extent are geopolitical borders self-evident markers of difference, territorial and otherwise, that create socio-spatial distinctions between places and groups? Or to what extent are they invented, permeable markers of division subject to reconfiguration and shifts of meaning for different actors who may cross them? Further, to what extent do the contours of self shift through various crossings of geopolitical and symbolic borders, such as those between racial, gender, ethnic, sexual, and class categories? And how does this engender processes of rebordering of self and place? Moreover, what do the paradoxes of borders, the inhabitation of the space between them, imply for the study of queer sexualities in their movement across borders? And what intricate realignments of identity, politics, and desire occur through the queer movement of officially designated spaces? Now, my forthcoming book, on which this talk is based, Contested Borders, investigates further this question through analyzing representations of dissident sexuality in literature written in French from the Maghreb, focusing primarily on recent autofictional literature, I like the term autobiographical fictional as well, written by a new generation of queer authors who are from the Maghreb and spent their childhoods and adolescences there, and then emigrated from the Maghreb to Europe, eventually settling in France. And these are the writers. I'm not going to talk about all of them now, obviously. Rachid O from Morocco, Ayat Chikab Dijaziri from Tunisia, Abdellah Taïa, who is quite famous, from Morocco, and Nina Bouraoui from Algeria. Yet in writing about dissident sexuality and gender, it's not writing about dissident sexuality and gender is not a contemporary phenomenon in the Maghreb, given the history of the Maghreb as a site of plural border crossings and border contestations, as well as cultural blendings, a crossroads between the Orient, the Occident, and Africa. Now, the representation of sexual alterity and difference shifts from being located as a private act to the public sphere much more overtly and quite centrally in the published work of this group of writers from the Maghreb, who are attempting, like their feminist predecessors, to reclaim what has been written out of dominant historical narratives and narratives of national belonging in the post-colonial nation-states of the Maghreb. Equally important, their auto-fictional writing serves as important primary sources for the study of sexual dissidence in the Maghreb and for examining the relation or the borders between the private and the public, between the individual and society, between self and other, between North Africa and Europe, between masculinity and femininity, and for the focus of this panel, between the past and the present. Autofictional writing itself is situated in the interstitial space between autobiography and fiction and provides a discursive opening to translate one's emergent sense of self textually into writing, into literary form, a translation that is never a simple reiteration or reflection of the self in its present understanding at the time of writing. The sense of self which protagonists and narrators seek is then brought into existence through the writing and takes shape as the text itself takes shape. Autofictional writing is not only the genre, but becomes the method in the literary work I look at, a process for the authors to reconfigure the contours of self that occurs through having undergone the crossing of geopolitical borders and being positioned in the space between two very different cultural worlds. Given that autofictional writing itself performs the crossing of generic borders, the borders of genre, as it addresses the effects of the material crossings of geopolitical borders by the authors or through their protagonists or narrators. These highly complex textual and political strategies respond to the fact that the authors that I'm looking at negotiate and produce new translations of sexual subjectivity as a shifting site of signification and meaning, given that Franco-Maghrebi spaces of sexual dissidence are inflected by globally circulating discourses and embodiments of queerness, reducible neither to received norms of homosexuality, presently or historically in the Maghreb, nor to Western forms of sexual identity and sexual politics. Now, a critical precedent to this work is that of the late Algerian feminist Assia Djebar, whose text Femmes d'Alger dans leur appartement, and this is the painting that it's on the cover, or it has now been translated as Women of Algiers in Their Apartment. Her book is named after Eugene Delacroix's famous painting here of 1834, based on his permission to gain entrance in 1832 to the home and cloistered harem of an Algerian man employed by a French colonial official, a masculine gaze that is linked to the colonial conquest of an Islamic or Oriental world. This stolen glance by the painter, which occurred only 2 years following the French conquest of Algeria in 1830, serves as the catalyst for Djebar's novel and becomes the controlling metaphor of the work, given that Algerian men gradually more disenfranchised and dispossessed under colonial rule strengthened their control of Algerian women. The book consists of collected and oral conversations by Algerian women, which are fragmented, reconstituted, transmitted often by sighs and echoes. And this implies not only the effects of women's silenced voices, but a recodification and rewriting of history and as personal experience through the emergence and mediation of strong female voices in order to disrupt the masculinist narration of colonial and post-independence history. an invocation of the Christavan semiotic, which operates in signifying practices as a transgression of the symbolic world of patriarchal language and culture. The fragmented bits and pieces of reconstituted and remembered conversations, spoken but not written or recorded, although they're written in Djebar's text, often from those who served alongside their male combatants in the Algerian Revolution as warriors, as suicide bombers, and resistant fighters, simply form a literature de combat, a littérature de combat in the Fanonian sense, given that post-independent Algeria did not honor its promise of emancipation for women. The women's testimonies are thus forms of resistance to received historical accounts of Algeria's colonial and post-colonial history, which I think relates a little bit to what Inga was saying, and are an attempt to recuperate Algerian women's lost voices. Noting that two of the women in the Delacroix painting appear to be in conversation, Djebar points out that their silence has not stopped reaching us, and that while there is no traditional seraglio now, these very masculine structures that confine and constrain women's movements and voices are still at work, she says, to impose the law of invisibility and the law of silence. The in-between space of the interdit, women's muffled, whispered, or sometimes screamed defiance, emerges into a feminine tradition and is also an interdiction expressing itself between the lines imposed by colonial and later by nationalist patriarchal language. Djebar also takes time to describe the veil as a modern seraglio that confines women's bodies and movements, though she also acknowledges the way in which the veil can be subversive, as it was during the Algerian Revolution, which is the long, bloody battle that finally ended in 1962 that gave Algeria independence, when women fought alongside their male comrades, and the veil was used to hide weapons. While the veil can serve as a visible border to separate men and women spatially, it can also potentially liberate and break down the public-private border so that women can claim the public sphere with impunity and without recognition by other men. So that's almost the reverse because of the masculinist gaze of this harem, because of course women are sort of disguised and are not recognized in the public space, and they can also have sort of a stolen glance. There is also a subversive discourse around the veil, the way the head nods towards other women, to other veiled women, to the ways in which the veil is shifted and adjusted. So far from being purely an oppressive symbol, the veil can be put to strategic use as it was during the revolution, but in a slightly different, nonverbal, but still resistant way in the period that followed. Speaking specifically to this, Djebar writes, "Et ces mêmes femmes présentes, saumaudiant, chuchotant, penchant la tête vers l'une, vers l'autre, arrangeant leur voile par petits gestes secs, faisant crisser les plis de tissu sur leurs cuisses lourdes," while referencing at the same time both the jolting effects of the years since the revolution and the surge of women's suffocated cries, despite their silenced, muzzled voices. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip a bit ahead. Another struggle encapsulated in the work of the queer Francophone writing from the Maghreb are questions around active and passive homosexuality as the defining structure of sexual relations between Arab Muslim men. Speaking of sexual relations between men in the Maghreb, Abdelhak Serhane, in his book L'amour circoncis, elaborates, "L'homosexualité active et l'homosexualité passive n'ont pas la même signification symbolique dans l'imaginaire collectif des Marocains. La première est considérée comme une manifestation de virilité par opposition à la seconde qui est vécue comme une source d'humiliation et de dégradation." And of course, this goes back to ideas about substitutive sex and that, women must remain virginal before marriage. And in the early Ottoman Empire, between 1516 and 1798, of course, there's a whole range of other literature in Arabic, which talks about, which male poets describe their love for beautiful young boys. And of course, these relationships were thought to be age-graded. They weren't necessarily there's debate as to whether they were fictional or real and so on. But of course, there's other work that suggests that they were not necessarily age-graded. They could also be inverted. For instance, here is a picture of a younger boy penetrating an older man, although he doesn't look very happy about it. But it can also work the other way, and that these relationships were much more complicated than simple active-passive homosexuality that was age-graded. Okay. Abdellah Taïa attempts to rupture the supposed fixity of the active-passive binary in his sexual relationship with other men in his book Une mélancolie arabe, where he writes of his Moroccan boyhood. At that time, in his boyhood, while he's still in Morocco, Abdellah meets a group of 3 older boys associated with phallic masculinity who greet him using a woman's name, Laila. The leader of the group, whom Abdellah finds quite handsome and attractive, has propositioned Abdellah sexually by fondling his buttocks. Abdellah knows what the group leader wants and reflects to himself, "Et lui, le beau, l'homme, le patron, le chef, m'a indiqué faussement gentil le chemin." And of course, I've deliberately, italicized those very masculine pronouns there because it looks like the active-passive binary is almost being set up here. But the reader soon learns that Abdellah's thoughts, as opposed to what's happening on the level of the narrative plot, are not about simply submitting to phallic masculinity and thereby being degraded and humiliated through the ways in which the passive sexual role has traditionally been characterized, but fantasizing instead about more egalitarian forms of same-sex sexual relations. Now, through the purposeful use of reflexive verbs, Abdellah imagines the encounter about to happen as marked by mutual erotic pleasure, betraying his intention simply to submit to the sexual authority of the group leader. He says, "Dans ma tête, je voyais même déjà ce que nous allions faire, inventer, se dénuder, se découvrir, se toucher," what we are going to do to each other. Here there is a fracturing or a splitting towards a shift and an imaginative desire for an opening to a different kind of sexual relationship between men with interchanges of sexual intimacy not prescribed in advance through predefined fixed gender positionings. And the passive sexual role here is translated, because he still takes the passive role, into one of sexual pleasure and sexual agency, opening up a new space of masculinity where the virilization of one sexual partner does not depend on the emasculation of the other. The text becomes a site of struggle to think oneself outside of the limiting and problematic gender and sexual borders. The struggle continues when he moves to France and has to resist racial objectification as a result of post-colonial and post-immigration conditions there. And I'll just give one final example, which is the work of Nina Bouraoui. And she, somewhat similar to Djebar, also, although she's a generation after Djebar, she also attempts to connect the double play of l'histoire, that is history of the word l'histoire in French, history as the story of the past told through hegemonic frameworks that often excludes the experiences of women and other minorities, and l'histoire as personal story or testimony but challenges, even interrupts, official versions. For Bouraoui, however, the past acts through her own body, represented through the body of the first-person narrator of her text, the biracial body as witness to the French-Algerian conflict and a site of historical cultural inscription and signification. So there's a trilogy of 3 texts, and I'll show you the third one in a moment, that addresses the historical and embodied trauma inherited from the Algerian Revolution and the effects of her parents' mixed marriage. Her father is Algerian, her mother is French. And the latter, of course, this marriage brings historical trauma more directly to Bouraoui's own lived experience, since she was born after Algerian independence. Now, Bouraoui's difference in Algeria stands out in stark contrast to others in the early days of independence. She was actually born in France, and then the family moved when she was still a baby to Algeria. But of course, she describes herself as an Arabisante, not a native speaker of Arabic, while living in Algeria, which alienated her from indigenous communities there when Algeria was trying to efface the traces of French colonial rule. Reflecting on this early experience of geographical displacement and sense of exile in Garçon, Manqué, that separates her from integration into the local culture while living in Algeria, she reflects, Ici, je porte, yeah, that's the right one. Ici, je porte la guerre d'Algérie. Ici, je porte la blessure de ma famille algérienne. The use of the French verb porter is significant here, given the importance of historical memory for the next generation who did not experience the violence of the Algerian Revolution directly, but still need to work through the inherited trauma through reclaiming historical memory and attempting to heal the wounds of the past through the embodiment of those memories in the present, which Bouraoui tries to accomplish through the act of writing. The crossing of geopolitical borders created initially in Bouraoui a sense of disbelonging and anxiety in Algeria, given the fact that she's the product of a mixed Algerian-French marriage, which especially in the years following independence in Algeria remained culturally loaded with the vexed colonial history of conflict and irresolution, which she carries, or porte, with her, and of which she herself is the embodiment. Now, when Bouraoui moves to Paris as a young adult, she attempts to create a new history unencumbered by any colonial past in her second work, Poupée Bella, which is the one I showed you before, wherein she celebrates being a body in the world and being lesbian. Although she doesn't use that word directly. She writes, Je suis à Paris, je suis en vie, je suis heureuse, je suis encore dans le monde, je suis une fille qui aime les filles, written with a sense of climaxing jouissance while postulating that she's in the very process of creating in Paris her own history, in resistance to the history that she inherited through her body by making connections to other female bodies. And her goal, of course, she writes about that being trouver sa place dans le cœur d'une fille, c'est enfin trouver sa place dans le monde. But this is also limiting and harmful, given that she tries to repress her Algerian past in order to become white, an act of self-effacement in order to assimilate to the lesbian subculture in the lesbian bars and clubs of Paris. So her next work, Mauvaises, Pensées, takes place in the clinical environment of her psychoanalyst office in Paris and is written without any paragraph breaks or chapter or sectional divisions, and it appears textually as if it's an extended book-length monologue, very often with long sentences and sporadic punctuations. It's even more fragmented than the other texts. There's a lot of rawness, stream of consciousness, free associations, and so on. But most of the text is written in the present tense, even though the events that are narrated have occurred in the past, in order to focus on the reflection and the significance of those events in the present, which is critical to the psychoanalytic process. As Bouraoui herself claims to her analyst, Je suis triste à cause de l'Algérie. Je suis le cœur d'Algérie. So notice the word cœur, heart, in French is now transplanted from finding her place in the heart of another girl, is now transplanted into Algeria. The analytic situation in Mes Mauvaises Pensées, the process of healing to which I refer, occurs through a symbolic return to the terre or grounding of Algeria and her cultural roots in order to reconcile the unresolved history the narrator has with her Algerian past. Another way of conceiving this third work is a textual return to Algeria, her own translation of the significance of Algeria to her, and an attempt to bring together her personal history and the fractured relation of French-Algerian historical relations, even in the most contingent ways, in order to find a way to be positioned in the world as a biracial French-Algerian lesbian. She writes of the emotional connection between the terre or the ground of her Algerian homeland and her desire for women, not only as interconnected, but contingent upon one another. She writes, Je marche dans le cœur, même de la terre, et donc de l'existence, through which she comes to realize the intersectionalities of her identity. Il y a un lien, she affirms, entre le cœur et la terre. So the cœur and the terre, the grounding and the heart, come together. So to conclude, Heather Love has written in her book, Feeling Backward, and she points out quite rightly that historically speaking, homosexuality has been marked by the recurring trope of wounded subjectivity, where forms of so-called gay freedom are produced in response to this history to resist the damage and thereby reaffirm queer existence, but always through a problematic disavowal of a damaged queer past. Love challenges queer work to explore a further engagement with negative affect rather than a disavowal of painful past, and I think that's what these writers are also trying to accomplish. Finally, I'm also trying to find or to work through or explore a decolonial queerness that embraces oversights and forms of amnesia through developing a set of analytics and practices to address a broader range of power relations and conditions of subalternity, where the idea of the border signifies political markings not only of geographical space, but of cultural, symbolic, and internal or psychic space as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Three of you have, well, I think all history is a political act, but the work that the three of you are doing is very, it's incredibly political, it's very overtly political, I would say. And I'm interested in kind of your subjectivity as authors in producing this, but also I'm interested in your audiences and the question of reception. And the kind of work that you're doing and the voices that you're bringing to the fore have not been heard before. So who is interested in hearing them now? If they are interested now and they weren't interested before, why is it that they're now interested? What is it that's changed? And also, is there anyone who isn't listening to you? Are there sections of the audience that you haven't been able to reach? I don't know, would anybody like to go first? And then I'll take questions from the audience. We can go a little bit over, so if you would like to ask a question, if you just wave your hand.
I don't mind going first with this one, particularly in terms of, well, to answer the two parts of your question there. With writing the script, Holly and I were very aware to not appear to be speaking on behalf of a community which we clearly don't represent politically or in terms of heritage. And most importantly of all, and I didn't mention this so much in the presentation, but the script was based upon the actual testimonies of enslaved people. So whereas they themselves had not been heard in Parliament, it was really important. So I've been, working in the archives for many years. The testimonies that have been gathered, the testimonies of the likes of Lado Equiano and Mary Prince. So the actors spoke the words. I literally assembled, like a collage, assembled the actual publications and writings of enslaved people and their defenders at the time and their advocates at the time. And so those were the voices that the actors were speaking. So it was not my voice, it was not Holly's voice. And that felt really important to do and to make that distinction that Holly and I weren't the interpreters of their experience, and we weren't ourselves the reproducers of that experience, but we were much more giving a space for those voices to come to the fore. In terms of the audience, it was really interesting because we had a very diverse audience everywhere that we toured. But many places as well that we toured, those were not diverse communities. And so quite frequently, people that we were kind of coordinating the production with, most particularly vicars in the local churches, would say, our audience is never this diverse on a Sunday morning. In fact, we never have this many people on a Sunday morning coming into church. So it did what we wanted it to do. It brought in people within the community who were there, but were not participating in these social spaces as a diverse community. I just give a really moving example of reaching out to that audience. On the Hembury production, we performed to over 1,000 school children over 3 days. That was incredibly moving. The children really engaged. We had to change the script somewhat for the children because it is quite graphic and in its discussion of the horrors of the slave trade. But the children were very much engaged and participated in that. But at the very final performance, I gave a talk about Equiano and his contribution to the abolition movement, and then I took questions from the audience. And there were 2 members of the audience who were American, one from Virginia, one from Alabama. And both of them came forward and spoke about how their families were both slave-owning families, large slave-owning families in those 2 respective regions. And the really emotionally difficult experiences that they were having to try to grapple with a past that they had been told was different from what they were now learning. And how they had been, they had grown up being told one version of, the good slave owner, our family were good and treated our slaves well, to actually then learning later in life actually the much more gruesome, brutal nature of slavery and what it was about. And that was a really moving part of the discussion. And I think certainly in terms of who's listening and who's not listening, I think that was a moment where perhaps I might have been in any other situation felt somewhat uncomfortable when someone's about to say, well, actually my family had slaves, and you're telling a different version of this history. But actually it generated a really, as I say, moving, but there was the atmosphere that was created in the church was one of of listening with respect to these really difficult, challenging, uncomfortable conversations. And Holly and I were very keen that that was what part of the production and going on tour was meant to do. It was meant to encourage people to have these difficult and challenging conversations, not just about the past, but most particularly the past and the present. And Henbury was one place where that really did take place in a really interesting way, but in a way that was, I think, ultimately very constructive.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Who's the audience and how has it changed? I was just thinking about that while listening to Inga's answer, what I was going to say. But I think what's happened with writing about class, or that kind of writing that, for example, Harold Heslop represents, is that it's changed how it's understood. It was originally thought of in political terms. The relations were related to the history of, say, the Communist Party or the Popular Front or such things. So you had, I mean, as I said, to start with, nobody even read that stuff. If you started talking about things they talked about in the 30s, in the 1950s, half the audience would get up and walk out of the room because they were against that idea of commitment. It starts to come back in the 70s and the 80s, but actually some of the people bringing that back are members of the Communist Party in the 70s and 80s. And so there's a certain amount of work that goes up to about 1990, and then around about the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, that sort of dies off again. And it's re-emerged, I think, from sort of, the 2008 financial crash onwards, and things like, you've got a generation of people coming into academia who've been activists in some way, or they were in Occupy, or they were in, various kind of movements since then. And also, society is much more class. In the 70s, when I was in 1976, when I went to my comprehensive school, Britain was one of the most socially equal countries in the world. It's impossible almost to imagine that. The amount of social change that's happened in this country is just, it's not surprising the public realm is in a state of, chaos, because that, in itself, it takes a certain amount of sort of British muddling through. Just the fact that, it's still not completely fallen apart. So I think this scenario's changed, and also we now look at these writers in different ways. We're interested in class itself, how that's fluid, how it intersects with sexuality, how it intersects with gender, how it intersects with race, which doesn't come up so much in those 30s texts because the post-war immigration hadn't happened at that point. But as George Orwell once said, in some ways, that entire Britain was based on exploiting the labour of the rest of the colonial kind of world. So, there's all this is coming very much up to the surface. So that's why I think there's an audience. I mean, for myself, being an academic, I mean, in some ways, the only way to live these things is to, one of the ways to live these things is to write about them, read about them, write about them, and that's one of the things that attracted me into being, I just went on from doing my, qualifications and did it because I could see it as a way you could do that. And in terms of an audience, I think, who's listening? Well, there's always people listening. I mean, I've always had the feeling there's few people interested in what I'm saying and writing about, even if it's a small number, and I suppose I concentrate on those and assume the rest of it will look after itself. But who's not listening? I think that number's reducing. I mean, there's still vested interest in, say, I'm in English literature, so there's still a canon. There are still implicit kind of middle class values controlling how English literature works to some extent. But I think they're much more up for grabs. The political stakes have risen, quite high over, at the moment. So we're not going to go back into sort of centrist kind of complacency. I mean, so I'm just trying to write as much as possible before the whole thing collapses, I suppose. That would be my answer on that.
Okay, I'll just be very brief, but I think for me, in terms of the audience and who's listening and so on, I mean, these texts are so minor, even within French literature, that I wanted to make them more accessible or available to Anglophone audiences. A problem with queer studies is that it's still very Western in its focus and also very Anglocentric in its focus. And I mean, to look at how things are, how queerness is encoded not only in different languages, but how it's also then thought about and translated. Now, these writers are writing in French, but they're not using French the same way as a native speaker of France would write in France. They're also destabilizing the former colonial language at the same time. They're also infusing it with Arabic phrases as well, quite deliberately, to sort of foreignize it. At the same time, in the French literary tradition, there's still this distinction between French literature, which is literature coming out of France, and littérature d'outre-mer, which is literature written overseas or far away. And that is sort of then marginalized. There isn't a conception yet of of world literature written in French, which we talk about more, I think, in English studies. I have to be careful as a white, although queer, but white person working in a Western academy writing about these things. But I mean, my approach, as I talk about in my book, is as a comparative. So I'm interested more in the encounters between and how both sides of the virgule, of the slash, are whatever the categories on either side are transformed through this, sort of interaction and encounter. And of course, I'm especially interested in issues around translation and the audience. Well, who's listening? I mean, I'm happy for anybody who's listening, but even with, like Nick said, but even within France, these texts are not all that well known. So there is an interested audience there as well. But I better keep quiet now because I see we're probably out of time.
Might partly have been covered by what you were just saying, but just a thought did strike me in the whole concept of invisible voices, of invisible to whom? Are we making some kind of assumptions about places where voices should be heard? Just because we can't hear them doesn't mean to say they don't have voices that are shared with each other. So basically, we're talking about voices heard to people like us, patriarchal white middle class people or whatever, and it may be right to expose those people to these voices as your project did, Inga, but to suggest that these people, before they're heard by middle class white people, have no voices actually is a slightly problematic assumption, that they're not talking to each other, that they've already got a network of understanding and voices. Likewise with the working class autobiographies that are filed in the Burnett collection, we shouldn't assume that this is the only vehicle by which they can tell their stories. They may well have been telling their stories already amongst each other, possibly not by writing them down, because that wouldn't necessarily be the mode of communication between working class people, but that doesn't mean to say that they have had no voices. It's just a matter of them being. So are we making a few assumptions about who should be hearing, and that their voices are invisible unless we hear them, whereas in point of fact they're actually already being expressed amongst themselves? If anybody wants to comment on that.
Point, Martin. Oh yes, I'm on that. I'm on 5 now. I think that's a very good point. I think from my perspective, in terms of breaking the silence and what we were trying to do there, it was much more to amplify voices within a national public history space. So it wasn't about the voices or the histories that might be told within the black community itself, but more about contesting and seeking to reconfigure a national public history about slavery and abolition, where within that history, the voices, contribution, experiences of enslaved people and most particularly black abolitionists and women abolitionists really don't figure prominently at all. And you know, that's both the public memory or public history on slavery and abolition, but that also filters down into the school curriculum and what's taught about slavery and the slave trade and abolition in the school curriculum as well. So that was something that we were very keen to. It was that particular space that we were very keen to challenge. Yeah.
I think I agree actually about that sort of national space. I think that actually often motivates people to write autobiographically. That certainly for mass observation, the archive based in Sussex, which is also a subject I research on, the current sort of people who write for mass observation, that's one of their motivations. We're writing for future historians. We're telling, you know, our side of the story, or the story of, you know, normal people or everyday people or whatever, you know, story, you know, they're particularly telling. So there's a desire for that to become part of a national conversation or to enter that national space in some ways. But I think the other thing is I don't think that distinction you mentioned between the us and them is kind of breaking down. I mean, the academy is still the academy. I mean, apart from the fact that universities themselves are trying to publicly engage anyway. I mean, I think, you know, there's a difference between, okay, yeah, if you're an academic who's got a full-time salary and a permanent job, yes, you are in a very privileged position. But I mean, academia itself is full of people who are in very precarious positions, you know, junior researchers, people teaching on 0-hour contracts. It's quite, you know, and the same for sort of doing office work as well, and, you know, people hired in through temps and, you know, whatever else. The whole structure is built on, you know, precarious labour. So I think that us and them boundary is breaking down, and so the case is not a question of whether they're sort of, you know, the conversations are going to happen. So yeah, we should kind of embrace that, because I don't think there's any alternative. It's not going to go back to some sort of, you know, stable structure.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a good one to ask, because you know, invisible according to whom? And I think for the writers that I'm looking at, yes, they're already speaking because they're already published. And I mean, Nina Bouraoui has written about 31 books. I mean, she's extremely, you know, prolific. But of course, they're not writing so much to be published. The writing for them is a site of struggle and a heuristic way of trying to figure out what it means to be a sexual subject, particularly in countries where they have come from, where that is simply not allowed, and then thinking when they go to France that they would somehow be sexually liberated. But then you find a whole other set of oppressions that come, you know, in that movement, mostly according to race and to, you know, hostilities toward immigration, Islamophobia, and so on. But I mean, I think my motivation is to sort of get this out there as these sexual struggles as a site of decolonization, because that has been lagging behind, I think, in post-colonial studies, especially. There's so much on race and on gender, and to see sexuality, I mean, and erotic autonomy and things as sites of further ways of decolonizing the mind, I think is important to get out there, and especially to look interrelationally at how these texts sort of, you know, also speak to each other in various ways as well. The connections between them, I think, is quite interesting. Sorry, my voice is.
While you were speaking, I recalled a comment that Frederick Douglass wrote in his autobiography, that the act of writing was writing himself into history. It was an act of creating his identity by writing. And I wonder if that, in a way, is going on for all of our voices, that they themselves are putting themselves in history by the act of writing. Equiano, the working class writers like Heslop, are doing that, aren't they? And I think Douglas's comment, I think, is very telling. The act of autobiography is doing that in a way, is putting yourself in history, isn't it?
Could I just say something? Just in regard to the invisibility question, which I think perhaps was deliberately provocative, I mean, I would have presumed that the invisibility, the presumption was its invisibility to mainstream, patriarchal, white people in positions of power who were deluded or not seeing or deliberately blinkered to seeing these alternative voices which have for a long time been excluded from mainstream representation. So the invisibility to those people still in structures of power, obviously. But other than that, I think that also misses part of the point that it's not just invisibility to those who are unable, who cannot, who do not wish to see, but invisibility to the groups, to the minoritized and excluded groups themselves, their invisibility to each other. Growing up as a young gay man in Britain, I wasn't talking with other gay people. I did not see representations of myself. I was invisible to myself because those representations were not included in the mainstream. And I think the presentation on Being Human 2019 earlier, also some of the participants in that said, this is the first time I felt included because they saw representations of themselves which they shared amongst each other. So I think people's being invisible to themselves is a part of the strategy of invisibility. So it's not just the nascience and the not seeing of those in positions of power, it's the invisibility of minority groups to themselves and therefore not able themselves to be empowered and to come together and to project their images to counter the deliberate exclusion of them from the mainstream.
Thank you. And thank you as well to all three of our presenters. Really, really wonderful presentations and so much to think about. I'm sorry that we have to bring this to an end because I feel like we could keep going and it raises so many really important questions. So for the audience, we'll reconvene at 5 o'clock, but now I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking our three speakers for that panel for a really, really stimulating session.